Yes, welcome to the 15th edition episode of The Impact Narrative.
You may be the only person keeping count, Mark, but I'm glad somebody is.
Yeah, it's we keep a record very carefully.
Excellent.
And on my left is Dr.Simon Mabon, who has agreed to talk to us today mainly about developments concerning America and Iran and Israel as well, and other things. As always, we're going to cover all the big topical issues with occasional glancing references to the misdemeanours of the Arsenal football team. And of course, Newcastle very nearly beat your rivals last night.
Very nearly, very disappointing.
So near and yet so far.
Which will signal the end for Mr. Benitez as manager of
Arsenal.
Newcastle.
All right.
Well, perhaps not, but
we'll see. Yeah, well, I think that is probably coming to an end, but that's another matter.
So
more serious, more serious things than that to discuss. And
do you have a pair of new shoes?
Well, they're not new, no, but they're. I'm going to keep them concealed, unlike your tennis racket, squash racket, whichever kind of racket it is. It's not often used nowadays.
Certainly not at present.
Anyway.
So,
Dr. Mabon, so we should discuss, I suppose, the announcement that occurred just
on Tuesday, less than 48 hours ago.
Less than 48 hours.
At which point, 48 hours ago, I was in London doing a talk at the LSE about Saudi and Iranian involvement across the Middle East, the extent to which they are involved in shaping the political nature of the regional landscape. And whilst I was there, obviously the clock was ticking with regard to Mr. Trump's decision whether to renegotiate or to re-sign or to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, that was essentially the deal that was struck by the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, P5 plus 1, and Iran, to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And clock ticked, and then Mr. Trump withdrew from the deal.
Yes, and really he had, perhaps we'll talk about Mr. Trump's motives in more detail, but he'd kind of painted himself into a corner, really, hadn't he? Because he'd said it was the worst deal in history, or words to that effect. And so really, once you say things like that, it's very difficult to do anything but...
Yeah, so I think to get to understand where we are right now, I think it's worth going back to the previous administration, to President Obama. And President Obama has been criticised for a whole raft of things, from domestic legislation to his foreign policy with regard to the use of drones, strikes across Asia, across the Middle East. But perhaps the shining light of his presidency, of his 2 terms perhaps, was this nuclear deal with Iran, an attempt to prevent further nuclear proliferation across the world. It was a product of a lot of diplomatic efforts, led by the Europeans in many ways, but obviously with America playing a prominent role. And that nuclear deal was an attempt to prevent further enrichment of uranium.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words today. Not enough.
Well, no, because you could say
obviously.
further enrichments of uranium, if you weren't careful.
No, you could very easily. And the nuclear deal was an attempt to stop that, to prevent Iran from getting what's being referred to as a breakout capability, the idea that within a short period of time a state would then be able to cross the threshold to get a nuclear weapon. So the nuclear deal was designed to prevent that from happening, and in return Iran would have its economic sanctions lifted, essentially be welcomed back into the international fold, into the international community. And that was the deal. The deal was designed to prevent that from happening, to lift sanctions, and try and ease tensions across the Middle East that have been ratcheted up for about 8 years now. But obviously with this nuclear deal, things have been sort of on the back burner for about the past 10, 20 years. There was certainly instances across the past 20 years of Israelis in particular getting incredibly worried about an Iranian nuclear deal. Iranian nuclear program.
Well, they're very worried about it, but where do we begin? I mean, it seems to me that from the European perspective, the terrible thing is the Middle East conflict developing into something like an exchange of nuclear weapons, because then Europe might be directly affected. But from the point of view of Israel, it would seem to me that they have their own kind of veto on a Iranian nuclear program in the form of just airstrikes against that. So that for Israel, what they want is for Iran to stop being a danger to Israeli interests, whether it's nuclear or not.
Essentially,
so that's why we get the worst deal in history, because essentially Israel's got nothing out of it. Iran has been given some credibility, and it's still going on doing the things which Israel and the United States don't like.
And I think you've raised a number of key points here. So, going back to, say, 2006, 2007, you had Israeli leaders stating publicly that Iran had a nuclear weapons capability, that it was developing a nuclear weapon, so framing this in real sort of existential concerns. Israel has its own set of unique security calculations. It's a very small state, geographically and in terms of its demographics, so it doesn't have that ability to withstand conventional military attacks, and it certainly doesn't have the capacity to withstand a nuclear attack. So obviously its own very unique history means that it's got these unique set of security perceptions and calculations. So it's very worried about Iran, not just because of its nuclear capabilities or perceived nuclear capabilities, but because its involvement with a number of different resistance organizations across the region. And I've chosen that word very carefully because resistance is a term used by a number of groups, such as Hezbollah, the Lebanese Body of God, Hamas, the Palestinian organization that has long challenged Israel. And resistance is used as a means of challenging the status quo across the Middle East. So you have this constant framing from 2006 onwards, I guess, from those in Israel. You have the nuclear deal that was struck, and then you have people like Mr. Trump and a number of people in the States saying that this is a very dangerous deal, that it doesn't go far enough, that it's the worst deal of all time, that it doesn't curb Iranian support for groups like Hezbollah, that it doesn't prevent, it doesn't do enough to prevent ballistic missile development, and it doesn't do enough to curtail this support for nefarious groups across the region.
Yeah, so I suppose for Israel, in fact, ballistic missile development is more important. It's because those vehicles could be used for conventional.
Exactly.
So if you can stop that, if you can get some kind of limitation on technological development of ballistic missiles, then you've kind of hit two targets with one weapon, as it were.
So sanctions had been placed on the Iranians for a long time. Crippling sanctions had a devastating effect on the Iranian people, as they normally do. Not the Iranian people always, but people of states that were sanctioned generally. And it also had a devastating impact on the Iranian economy. So many in Iran were relatively pleased that this nuclear deal had been signed, a bit of a thaw, a bit of a rapprochement potentially, but there were a number of states across the Gulf and across the Middle East generally who were very anti the deal. So Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, perhaps not quite as vociferously, and certainly Israel, were all very critical of the deal because it didn't curtail Iranian activity, and it didn't do enough to stop further development, and it didn't do enough to stop ballistic missile development. So that's the landscape that Mr. Trump came into. And that landscape is replicated, I think, in the US. And maybe this is more sort of your territory than mine, Mark, but I think there is a very strong anti-Iranian sentiment in the US.
Oh, well, absolutely. And, well, where do we start? But I think 1979, was it, the hostage crisis?
79 and 80.
I was, funnily enough, thinking just the other day that if Iran hadn't, taking those hostages was really a miscalculation, it seems to me, because all you need to do, if you want American feelings to be agitated, then that is almost like their biggest humiliation, although obviously severe humanitarian considerations as well. But the fact that the Iranian demonstrators could seize embassy staff in that fashion was really making America seem impotent. So Iran is, I would presume, the nation, the least favoured nation to Joe Sixpack in the United States. Whereas if they'd just toppled the Shah and not taken the hostages, then it could be that now cooler heads could prevail when they're thinking about Iran. Anyway,
of course, I mean, let's not frame this purely as an Iranian set of activities that has framed events in this particular way. I mean, let's take it back briefly to 1953, the coup d'etat that toppled the nationalist, populist figure, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a democratically elected prime minister in Iran. Back when democracy was,
Yes, well, I think this is covered in our a book that I noticed the other day called British Foreign Policy Since 1945. I think that's really rather a good book. And so, moving to the... so obviously there's a long history of antagonism between the United States and I guess what Trump is doing here, whereas Obama is being the arch pragmatist and saying, it's the deal that's important rather than, the past or whatever. Mr. Trump is just exploiting the fact that most American voters in his catchment area will just hear the word Iran and reach for their semi-automatic weapon.
Indeed. And I think that climate, is key, because it's that climate, those perceptions that shape how people are acting at this point. And there's obviously this anti-Iranian sentiment in the US, and I think that one of the reasons why Mr. Trump has done this, has pulled out of the deal, is to placate that domestic audience, as well as making sure that his new friends, if you will, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, in Saudi and in the Emirates, are on side, and to keep the Israelis happy, Mr. Netanyahu happy. So I think there's a double sense of speaking to two different sets of audiences here, but there is that strong American sense of speaking to that domestic constituency, with the Israel lobby as well playing a prominent role.
And we're also aware of the oil element of this. That was it China have signed a deal with Iran. They're getting their energy needs supplied by Iran rather than by Saudi Arabia. So if the sanctions are reimposed, then the Saudis will benefit. But also, of course, if Iranian oil is not freely available on the world market, then the price of gas generally rises anyway, and the Americans with inexhaustible, it seems, supplies of oil through fracking. It's obviously any oil that they export or whatever, if they are into that kind of thing. In other words, there's economic advantages as well as strategic, supposed strategic advantages.
But on that point, Mark, let's not suggest, and I've seen a number of people suggesting that this is the case, that this is about regime change and then seizing the oil. And this is certainly not what's
But again, they don't really want to seize the oil, the Americans, because they've got plenty of their own. That's for the future. Oil seizing wars.
So that's what was going on. That's the sort of climate that was taking place at this point. And then on Tuesday night, he pulled out of the deal and said, "That's it. We're not going to renew it. We're going to reimpose sanctions. The sanctions are going to be reimposed gradually over a period of 6 months." There was an interesting briefing given by 2 State Department officials yesterday that fleshed out how this is all going to work. And that it's a gradual process to allow American businesses a chance to pull out, to remain in compliance with all the legal demands, to make sure that everything falls into place in the right way and that American companies aren't damaged. But there will be a reinstation of sanctions, and there will be repercussions. And this leads us on, I think, to where we are as of, 12 hours ago? 10 hours ago? 6 hours ago?
Yes, the repercussions.
Yeah. So, writing in the conversation on Tuesday, I suggested that there would be a number of people who were concerned about what would happen next. Because the nuclear deal at least brought people together. It brought them to a particular forum and meant that there would be dialogue. Hopefully working towards more of a rapprochement. And this was certainly something that President Obama was very keen on. He gave a long, deep interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic while he was still president, and he talked about the Iranians and the Saudis sharing the Middle East. That's not something that the Saudis wanted to hear.
No.
And so that diplomatic forum was an attempt to follow up on that sharing of a regional environment. But now that forum has been cancelled, at least the American dimension.
Yeah. Yeah, well, still the European dimension, mind.
which I think we'll get onto in a little
Right.
bit, because I think we can see that as something to move forward, potentially, with a little bit of hope. But for now, we saw that that last night, we woke up to the news that there were allegedly Iranian missiles launched on Israel, launched on the Golan Heights, and there were also alleged reports of an Israeli strike in Syria as well.
Yeah. So what's the truth behind these? Are you saying that maybe there wasn't an Iranian missile attack?
That's what people are saying, and I've heard a number of sources that I think are relatively credible saying that this is the case.
Right.
It just shows the level of uncertainty now. It shows that where before there were sort of stabilizers, there was a sense of things being contained within a particular environment, constrained because everyone knew what was at stake. Everyone knew, the rules of the game, if you will. But now those rules have been discarded. The gloves are off. The Israelis are terrified about regional repercussions. They're concerned about what Hezbollah will do. They fought a war against Hezbollah 12 years ago.
Yeah.
They have very serious concerns about what's happening on their northern border, which is where Hezbollah is based. Hezbollah, of course, is a very strong Iranian ally, as well as being a member of the Lebanese government, which
Exactly.
is something else that happened over the
Yes,
weekend.
yes.
And I think it just shows that there's all this uncertainty, there's all of this doubt about what's actually going to happen. And I was chatting to a colleague, a certain Dr.Mark Lacey,
Oh, right.
who wants to come on our show next week to talk about the royal wedding.
Right, well, I think that would be delightful.
He's,
there's no better person, really, to...
throwing a party to
right.
celebrate the wedding.
Yeah.
So he will certainly be very much in favour of the royal wedding.
Yes, and Meghan, of course, having to give up her hopes of wedding Mark and settling for a member of the royal family instead.
Indeed.
Second best, but still, hopefully she'll mend in time.
I'm sure the emotional scars will heal. But
Anyway,
we're
yes.
talking about this. We're talking about what will happen, and I think the concern is that many in Israel worry about what will happen next, about what Iran will do, about how strong Iran will get in the coming 5-10 years if nothing happens. And you alluded to it earlier, Mark. This sense of Israel has a penchant, if you will, for being preemptive.
Yes.
And there are a number of occasions that this has happened. In 1981, I'm going to test you. Can you remember the name of the reactor in Iraq that the Israelis struck?
Was it Reactor 2?
It was number 3.
Ah.
No, it was Osirak. The Osirak reactor.
Yes.
That the
That's
Israelis
one of the...
that they were worried
reactor
about.
too.
And then they struck also a
Is there another quiz? Reactor 4.
A perceived nuclear reactor in which state, Mark? In 2007.
Oh, now you've caught me on the hoof. Where would it be? Bechuana land? I know there is no such thing anymore, but it just suddenly came into my mind.
Right.
No, go on.
In Syria.
Oh, right, of course, yes.
So there is a precedent here, and if we go back to what Mr. Netanyahu has been saying, go back not only to this past month where we talked about this previously, his dossier, his presentation, his PowerPoint presentation, that he needs to take a few lessons from you, obviously.
I think so.
But also, dating back further, he's stood up at the United Nations on a number of occasions and framed Iran as a quote-unquote existential threat. He said the line, I'm quoting him directly, if it walks like a duck, if it talks like a duck, then what is it? It's a duck, but this duck is a nuclear duck.
Yeah.
And he took a picture of a bomb, a cartoon drawing of a bomb, to the United Nations.
We had this last week, but they should have done a drawing of a duck. Really.
I should. Imagine.
But anyway, go on. With a very big, powerful-looking beak.
Excellent editor can no doubt impose a duck here.
Yes. Yeah, there's some good...
The eyes and the beak. And it's all about this framing. To try and create legitimacy for what Israel might do. To try and delegitimize the Iranians. To try and frame them as a threat to world peace. Not just because of the nuclear program, but because of their nefarious involvement in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Saudi, in the Palestinian case for the Israelis. And this is nefarious, not to say that Israel is innocent, or the Saudis are innocent, or the Americans or the British are innocent. This is just the strategic thinking of people in Jerusalem, of people in Washington, and people in Riyadh.
Yeah.
That this is what Iran is doing. This is the type of action that Iran has been involved in, and will be more and more involved in, because there is no nuclear deal. The nuclear deal didn't do enough to curtail that type of activity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So those are the concerns.
Hmm.
And I fear that more moments of instability and uncertainty will be viewed through this prism of the shackles are off, the gloves are off, there are no rules now, and these existential concerns. And I think those existential concerns are built into the very fabric of the Israeli society, going back to obviously the Holocaust, the establishment of the Israeli state, the sense of never letting anything like that happen again. That is built into the fabric of the Israeli state, which is why there is this desire for preemptive strikes.
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, that is built into the fabric of the state.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Britain got involved, and Boris Johnson appeared on, was it Good Morning?
It was Fox and Friends.
Fox and Friends, yes.
After writing an op-ed in the New York Times.
Yeah. And his eloquence clearly influenced the president's thinking, and it's a tribute to Britain's weight, as well as the eloquence of Boris Johnson, that the president decided that he'd better not show the world just how moved he was by Mr. Johnson's rhetoric, and just went ahead with his original decision anyway. But inside, he was a changed individual. But no, I mean, to be honest, that shows, first of all, the general European concern, fielding America's supposedly closest ally to tell Trump not to do what he was about to do. But it also, I think there's a certain amount of courage. The only thing that's interesting was that Boris Johnson was clearly peddling a message which wouldn't go down well with the extreme right in Britain. So he garnished it with a ridiculous comment about Theresa May's policy on Brexit, saying...
So what was this garnishing then, Mark?
Well, he said that the government's, what is obviously Theresa May's preferred option of a kind of a soft Brexit and a currency partnership and all, was a crazy policy. And clearly what he was doing there was to remind people that the extreme right of the Brexiteer movement, whatever, the pro-Israeli element of the Brexiteer, because there is obviously an overlap, admiration for Israel being very much rooted in the same kind of feeling that Britain was the underdog in the Second World War, Israel therefore, can do no wrong, basically. So he went against that lobby by being in favour of the worst deal in history, but he did then remind the people, the Brexiteers at home, that he is one of them by doing something which would have earned any other Foreign Secretary instant dismissal. Just as soon as the airwaves had stopped crackling, then his P45 would have been in the post.
And why has this not happened again, Mark?
Well, because
this in the past, but
because first of all, he is the Prime Minister's bag carrier. In this case, he's amusingly enough, he was actually the EU's bag carrier. He was delivering the EU's message. So he's a person of no influence, consequence, or whatever on the world stage or anything. But having him outside the cabinet would be a lot more dangerous than having him inside. So that's he has, I think, settled into the view that although he has no power, he is prominent. He gets on television a lot. So the Foreign Secretary's job is one which he can feel it suits him for his future. I mean, to become Prime Minister after being Foreign Secretary looks natural. Becoming Prime Minister after being, Climate Change Secretary or whatever that Mr. Gove is, doesn't really, or Minister for Paperclips, which Andrea Leadsom is, all these, and nobody, which Joseph Rees-Mogg is, Minister for Eton or whatever, Minister for posh, antiquated ideas. Anyway, there we go. So I mean, that was very amusing. What he did, he obviously was so chagrined by having to tell Mr. Trump. I mean, it's a losing, but he was bound to fail.
Yeah.
But it's also a message that he may privately agree with, but which he doesn't want people to think he agrees with. He doesn't want people to think he's soft on Iran, and so he took this ridiculous gamble of, but basically what he's done is destabilise the government further, because Mrs. May's critics can just say, if you can't sack a guy who just drives a cart and horses through cabinet discipline, then you're not really Prime Minister.
And that's the sort of thing that Mr. Corbyn was getting at yesterday in PM.
Well, he was, but it's an open goal. It was the kind of one that Perez or whatever missed from against Spurs yesterday, from 7 yards out, apparently, tripping over his feet or something ridiculous. No, it wasn't. It was an open goal. He couldn't possibly miss. And of course, the other thing is that the disservice that's being done to Theresa May is also a disservice to Britain's negotiating position. The more you destabilise Theresa May, the more likely it is that the EU is just going to continue to say no to any sensible deal, because they know that in the end, we are faced with, we've got an ideal scenario now, and bit by bit it's going to become less and less ideal, and the EU is going to just stop when it feels satisfied that it's got a deal which
how long is
rubs
left?
our noses in it.
How long do we have left before the deal has to be signed?
Well, signed. I mean, it's October, I think, is the time when.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Tick tock, tick tock.
Yeah, another ticking clock.
Indeed. And Mark, just very quickly before we wrap this up, because I'm conscious that we're running out of time.
Yes.
I've got to run across campus.
Wow.
To get to a lecture.
For charity.
Alas.
Oh, right.
For more practical reasons.
Okay.
Is this, do you think, Mr. Johnson positioning himself for his next job, or is this just him trying to secure his own job at present? Or?
Oh, no, Mr. Johnson, whatever happens, he's got a future in the limelight, and that's what he wants, really.
Right.
But obviously is desperate to become Prime Minister. And so, and that really did make it obvious, because to use the word crazy in relation to your own government's policy, it's a sign that he is worried that he's going to lose traction with and hope. As I guess at the same time, that visit was good because it showed that he was capable of being pragmatic and talking to. There's lots of good things came out of that for Johnson, on the assumption that the Conservative Party is ever going to be desperate enough to put a man like that.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
One word answer, please.
Right. Wenger.
Will
Benitez.
Mr. Johnson
Become
ever
manager of
become
Arsenal.
Prime Minister?
No.
Okay, excellent. Heard it here first. Well, maybe not first, but so to wrap this up, I think what we've been getting at is that this is a point of uncertainty, time of crisis, lots of unpredictable things happening, lots of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, to coin a phrase put forward by Donald Rumsfeld. But I think what we are seeing is that Mr. Johnson and other European leaders are working tirelessly to save what is left of the deal. And
I wouldn't say he'd be working tirelessly, but there are other people. I mean, obviously with the German Chancellery, etc., who'd be.
And the Iranians have suggested that they too are open to this type of deal. That they're open to all possibilities, they've said, which includes the good and the bad. And so I think it's certainly.
Well, two things on that. First of all, as you know, just to wrap it up, but firstly, this has destabilised the Iranian regime, and hardliners are going to be. But the second thing, of course, is that any continued cooperation between Europe and Iran is likely to run up against the effects of American sanctions. So, for example, trade deals with there'll be a price to pay. There'll be retaliatory measures from the states. So this is another occasion where really a realist view of all this would seem to be prevalent, in that all these states are working for their own self-interest, and the result is a lot of contradictory manoeuvres and a lot of people perhaps breaking from their hurting the interests of supposed allies. People who are allies in one controversy are now pitched against you in another controversy. So very confusing.
Very worrying times.
Thankfully, Mr. Trump is the only one who really can see his way through this to another triumph a la the because of course the North Korean thing going, the exchange, about 3 detainees released yesterday. This all looks great.
Which is good news.
And it shows that he's thinking his strongman tactics will do the same in the Iran thing, and we wait to see because it's far more complicated, obviously.
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed that some form of calmer heads will prevail, and that next week we can talk all about the royal wedding, and we don't have to touch about events across the Middle East.
Excellent.
We can hope.
Yeah, we can. And with that, it's, again, good night from
him.
And good night from Roz, from me.